Mothers always know exactly which ribs to slip a knife between. Beatrice chose cold precision. "Stay home," she ordered over lukewarm coffee, voice flat. "Abigail wants perfection." "You'll just ruin her photos." Blood rushed, ears rang, pride snapped, so she stayed away until a tuxedoed stranger demanded hard answers. Dust hung suspended in shafts of morning light, catching the distinct chemical odor of mineral spirits. Maeve kept her head down, a piece of rough grit sandpaper pressed hard against the curved arm of a salvaged Victorian settee. She rubbed in tight, aggressive circles, wood flakes piled around her knees. Her knuckles were chalky white, dried out, webbed with tiny, stinging microcuts. Beatrice stood 3 feet away, clutching her beige leather handbag against her stomach like it was a shield against airborne poverty. She hadn't taken off her trench coat. She never did when she came to Maeve's apartment. "You're ruining the grain," Beatrice observed. Her voice didn't rise. It rarely needed to. It was a perfectly calibrated instrument, carrying the exact frequency required to vibrate through Maeve's skull and settle as a dull ache behind her eyes. Maeve blew a puff of air upward, sending a loose strand of hair out of her eyes. She didn't look up. "It's mahogany, Mom. It can take a beating." "I suppose you would know." Beatrice shifted her weight. Her heels made a sharp, impatient click against the cracked linoleum floor. The apartment smelled of old garlic and bleach, a scent Maeve barely registered anymore, but one that clearly offended her mother. Beatrice's perfume, a heavy, aggressive sandalwood mixed with something sharp, like crushed juniper, muscled its way into the small room, suffocating the smell of the wood varnish. Maeve finally stopped sanding. She wiped her hands on her stained denim apron, feeling the familiar, gritty texture of dried glue and wood dust. "You didn't drive 40 minutes into the city on a Tuesday morning to critique my restoration techniques. What's wrong? Did Abigail chip a nail before her final dress fitting?" It was a cynical jab, but with her sister, it was a statistical probability. Abigail's wedding was less an event and more a military operation, complete with casualties, acceptable losses, and an ironclad chain of command. Beatrice was the 5-star general. Beatrice unclasped her handbag. The hardware gave a crisp, expensive snap. She withdrew a thick, cream-colored envelope. It wasn't sealed. She placed it onto the edge of the kitchen counter, taking care not to let her manicured fingers touch a stray smear of dried coffee. "Thomas's parents have hired a photographer from New York," Beatrice said, her tone conversational, yet heavily weighted. "He shoots on film, very raw, very exposed. It's an editorial style. Everything will be documented, every angle." Maeve stared at the envelope. She recognized the thick, textured cardstock. It was the same paper used for the Save the Dates that had been mailed out 6 months ago. The ones that had Abigail and Thomas's initials embossed in rose gold. "Okay," Maeve said slowly, feeling a cold, familiar stone drop into the bottom of her stomach. "I know what a photographer does, Mom." "Abigail is under a tremendous amount of pressure," Beatrice continued, ignoring her. She stepped closer, her eyes dropping to Maeve's hands. The calluses, the grease under the fingernails. Then, her gaze drifted up to Maeve's face, resting specifically on the faint, jagged scar that cut through her left eyebrow, a souvenir from a childhood bike accident Abigail had caused, but somehow avoided blame for. Then, Beatrice looked at Maeve's body, the heavy, shapeless flannel, the bulk she carried around her hips and shoulders. It was a forensic examination, completed in 3 seconds. "She wants perfection, Maeve," Beatrice said. The words were soft. That was the worst part. If she had yelled, Maeve could have yelled back. But Beatrice delivered cruelty with the practiced bedside manner of a doctor giving a terminal diagnosis. "It's a black tie aesthetic. The country club, the lighting, the guests." "Just say it," Maeve whispered. Her throat felt tight, thick with sandpaper dust and decades of suppressed resentment. "Skip the wedding," Beatrice said. She didn't blink. "You'll make her look bad." The silence that followed was absolute, save for the rhythmic, metallic ticking of the radiator in the corner. Maeve looked at her mother. She searched the older woman's face for a crack, a flinch, a sign of hesitation. There was none. Beatrice's expression was locked in placid resolve. "You're unpolished, Maeve," Beatrice added, as if providing a helpful clarification. "You're loud. You wear those awful boots. You don't fit the dresses. It will just be awkward. For you, mostly. We don't want you feeling out of place. And Abigail doesn't want to spend her special day worrying about managing your eccentricities." Maeve looked down at her hands. They were shaking, just a tremor, barely visible, but she felt the vibration deep in her bones. She wanted to scream. She wanted to pick up the heavy oak mallet on her workbench and smash it through the drywall. She wanted to demand to know why she was treated like a walking contagion in her own family. Instead, a bitter, cynical laugh scraped its way up her throat. "So, I'm being banished from the family photos. Am I being digitally erased from the childhood albums next?" "Don't be dramatic." Beatrice tapped the envelope on the counter. "There is a check inside, $5,000, and a voucher for a wellness retreat in Sedona. Go on Thursday, come back Monday. It's fully paid. You need a break anyway. You look exhausted. Your skin is terribly sallow." A bribe. She was being bought out of her sister's wedding. Maeve reached out and touched the edge of the envelope. The paper was smooth, cool. $5,000. That was 3 months of rent. That was a new commercial sander. That was the exact price of her absence. "Did Abigail put you up to this?" Maeve asked, her voice sounding hollow, disconnected from her body. "Abigail is too sweet to say it herself," Beatrice lied smoothly. "But she was crying about it last night. She wants her sister there, of course, but she knows how much you hate these things. She knows you'd be miserable. We are doing you a favor." A favor. The phrase tasted like bile. "Keep the check," Maeve said, turning her back on her mother. She picked up the sandpaper again. She pressed it against the wood, her knuckles screaming in protest. "I won't go. You don't have to pay me." "Take it, Maeve." "I said keep it," Maeve barked, her voice finally snapping loud and harsh, echoing off the bare walls. Beatrice stiffened. She pulled her coat tighter around her chest. "Fine, mope in your sawdust. But remember, this is your choice. You chose not to come." Maeve didn't turn around. She listened to the sharp click-clack of her mother's heels retreating to the door. She heard the deadbolt slide, the door open, and pull shut with a heavy thud. Alone in the apartment, Maeve dropped the sandpaper. She braced her hands on the workbench, her chest heaving, struggling to pull air into lungs that felt packed with concrete. She smelled the mineral spirits. She smelled the faint, lingering trail of sandalwood perfume. And then, slowly, she slid down the wall until she hit the floor, burying her face in her rough, stained hands. Saturday arrived with a heavy, oppressive heat that clung to the city like a wet wool blanket. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the temperature inside Maeve's apartment had climbed to a stifling 86 degrees. The cheap box fan in her window rattled violently, pulling in thick, humid air from the alleyway that smelled faintly of warm garbage and exhaust fumes. Maeve sat in the center of her living room, stuck to a vinyl dining chair. She was wearing a faded, oversized t-shirt and loose athletic shorts. A half-eaten bowl of cereal sat on the table beside her, the milk warm and turning gray from the cheap chocolate puffs. The ceremony was starting in exactly 1 hour. She told herself she didn't care. She told herself that a wedding at the Highland Estate Country Club, a place where the lawns were manicured with nail scissors and the waitstaff wore white gloves, would have been agonizing anyway. She hated small talk. She hated wearing Spanx. She hated the way her mother's friends would look at her with thinly veiled pity, asking her if she was still playing with furniture for a living. "I am better off here," she thought, tossing a stale cereal piece toward a fly buzzing near the sink. But her body betrayed her. Her stomach churned with a sour, hollow ache. Her leg bounced relentlessly, sending rhythmic vibrations through the floorboards. Every few minutes, her hand reached for her phone on autopilot, her thumb swiping open Instagram before she forced herself to lock the screen and toss it away. By 3:30, she couldn't take it anymore. She picked up the phone. The algorithm, cruel and efficient, had already pushed the stories to the top of her feed. Abigail's bridesmaids. There were 6 of them. identical clones of blonde perfection wrapped in sage green silk. They were holding flutes of champagne, tossing their heads back in synchronized laughter. Maeve tapped the screen. Next story. There was Abigail. She looked stunning. It hurt to admit it, but she did. The dress was a cascade of ivory lace that hugged her perfectly, falling into a dramatic train. Her hair was swept up in an effortless, complex arrangement. No stray hairs. No sallow skin. Perfection. In the background of the video, Maeve saw her mother. Beatrice was adjusting the veil, her face beaming with a radiant, genuine pride that Maeve hadn't seen directed at her since she won a middle school spelling bee. A sharp, physical pain bloomed behind Maeve's ribs. It wasn't just jealousy, it was grief. It was the absolute, undeniable confirmation that her family was a closed circle, and she was standing on the outside watching through dirty glass. She wasn't just the black sheep, she was a blemish, a stain on their flawless aesthetic. "Screw this," Maeve muttered. Her voice sounded raspy, unused. She stood up abruptly, the vinyl chair pulling at the sweat on her thighs with a loud tearing sound. She walked into her bedroom and pulled open her closet. She bypassed the few nice dresses she owned, the ones she had frantically tried on last week before her mother's visit, and grabbed a pair of dark, heavy jeans and a plain black tank top. She pulled on her scuffed leather work boots. She didn't know what she was doing. It was masochism, pure and simple. But sitting in her sweltering apartment while her erasure was finalized felt worse than whatever humiliation awaited her. She grabbed her keys. The drive out to the Highland estate took an hour. Maeve's beat-up sedan lacked air conditioning, so she drove with all the windows rolled down, the hot wind whipping her hair into a tangled knot. The engine gave a high-pitched whine whenever she pushed it past 60, a pathetic sound that mirrored her internal state. She turned off the highway and onto the winding, tree-lined roads that led to the country club. The air changed here. It felt cooler, shaded by massive, ancient oaks. The smell of hot asphalt faded, replaced by the scent of cut grass and expensive mulch. When she reached the iron gates of the estate, she didn't pull through the main entrance. Instead, she took a service road she had spotted on Google Maps, a gravel path intended for catering trucks and staff. Her tires crunched loudly against the loose stones, kicking up a cloud of white dust. She parked her car near a cluster of large green dumpsters, hidden behind a row of towering arborvitae bushes. Cutting the engine, the sudden silence in the car was deafening, quickly filled by the muted, rhythmic thumping of a bass line drifting across the manicured lawns. The reception had started. Maeve stepped out of the car. The heat of the engine block radiated against her shins. She leaned back against her car door, crossing her arms over her chest. She could see the massive white tent erected on the back terrace of the clubhouse. String lights glowed warmly against the fading daylight. Silhouettes moved against the canvas. People dancing, laughing, drinking. She stayed there for what felt like hours. The sun dipped below the tree line, dragging a bruise-colored twilight across the sky. Mosquitoes began to swarm, biting at her bare arms, but she didn't swat them away. She just stood there, breathing in the smell of roasted meat from the catering exhaust vents, mixing with the sour smell of the dumpsters. She was an idiot. What was the plan? Storm the tent? Throw a glass of red wine on Abigail's lace dress? Demand a microphone and give a speech about maternal neglect? No, she didn't have the energy for a scene. She was just a ghost haunting her own life. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against a crushed pack of cigarettes she had found under her passenger seat. She didn't smoke, not really. Only when she was drinking, or when her nerves were shredded so finely she felt like she might vibrate out of her own skin. Tonight qualified. She pulled one out, placing it between her lips. She fished around for a lighter, her thumb flicking the rusted metal spark wheel. Click, nothing. Click, click. A pathetic spark, no flame. "Damn it," she hissed, throwing the lighter onto the gravel. "You're flooding it." The voice came from her left, deep and startlingly close. Maeve jumped, dropping the cigarette. She spun around. Emerging from the shadows of the tall bushes, walking down the gravel path away from the tent, was a man. He was tall, his shoulders slumped underneath a tailored black tuxedo jacket. His bow tie was completely undone, hanging in loose black ribbons down his crisp white shirt. As he stepped into the faint amber glow of a nearby security light, Maeve's breath hitched in her throat. It was Thomas, the groom. He looked terrible. In the engagement photos, Thomas had possessed the kind of effortless golden boy charm that made him look like a luxury watch model. Perfect jawline, clear eyes, a smile that suggested he had never worried about a bill in his life. The man standing in the gravel parking lot looked like he had just survived a shipwreck. His dark hair was disheveled, matted with sweat at the temples. There was a tight, gray exhaustion pulling at the corners of his mouth. He held a crystal tumbler in his right hand, the ice mostly melted, leaving a pale amber wash of expensive bourbon at the bottom. Maeve froze, pressing her spine against the warm metal of her car door. She prayed the shadows were deep enough to hide her. She hadn't seen Thomas in over a year, not since a brief, agonizingly awkward family dinner where she had spilled water on her lap and her mother had treated her like an incompetent toddler for the remainder of the evening. Thomas stopped about 10 feet away. He took a slow sip from his glass, his eyes scanning the parked catering vans. He hadn't recognized her yet. He just saw a figure by the dumpsters. "Got a light?" he asked, his voice rough, scraping against the quiet hum of the crickets. Maeve swallowed hard. "No, mine's dead." Her voice cracked on the final word, betraying her. Thomas paused. He tilted his head, stepping closer. The security light washed over his face, and she saw the moment his brow furrowed in confusion, followed instantly by a jolt of recognition. "Maeve?" He said her name as if he was trying out a foreign word. She didn't answer. She looked down at her scuffed boots, her face burning with a sudden, intense humiliation. Being excluded was one thing. Being caught lurking by the garbage like a feral raccoon was entirely another. Thomas closed the distance between them, stopping just a few feet away. The smell of him reached her bourbon, expensive fabric, and the sharp, metallic scent of nervous sweat. "What are you doing out here?" he asked. He wasn't angry. He sounded genuinely baffled. He looked back toward the white tent, where the muffled sound of a brass band was playing a painfully cheerful pop cover. Then he looked back at her. Her jeans, her black tank top. Were you looking for a parking spot?" A harsh, ugly sound tore out of Maeve's throat. It took her a second to realize it was a laugh. "No, Thomas, I'm not looking for parking." She pushed off the car, crossing her arms defensively. "I was just getting some air. Enjoy the party. You look like you're having a blast." The sarcasm was thick, a defense mechanism firing on all cylinders. Thomas didn't rise to the bait. He looked down at his glass, swirling the melted ice. "It's suffocating in there." "Your mother has cornered my uncle," explaining the lineage of her antique silver collection. "Abigail is, well." He stopped, his jaw tightening so hard the muscle twitched. "Abigail is busy." Maeve watched him. There was a crack in the perfect veneer, a massive, jagged fissure running right down the center of the golden boy. "Busy?" Maeve prodded, unable to stop herself. Thomas looked up at her, his eyes dark and exhausted. Busy screaming at a 20-year-old catering waitress because they brought out the prime rib 5 minutes off schedule. He let out a long, slow breath. "I just needed a minute. Or a year." Maeve shifted uncomfortably. She didn't want to feel sympathy for him. He was part of them. He was the prize Abigail had won, the final accessory to complete the perfect portrait. "Well," Maeve said, kicking at the gravel, "better get back in there. They'll notice you're missing. The photographer needs his editorial shots." Thomas frowned, stepping closer. "Maeve, seriously, why are you out here in the dirt? We've been waiting for you all day. We held the family portraits for 20 minutes before your mother finally told the photographer to pack it up." Maeve froze. The humid air suddenly felt freezing against her skin. "What?" "The portraits," Thomas repeated, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Abigail said you promised to be there by 2. When you didn't show, she was furious. She said it was typical." Maeve's heart slammed against her ribs. The thudding in her chest was so violent she felt it in her throat. She stared at him, trying to process the words. "We've been waiting for you." What are you talking about? Maeve asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I wasn't invited. Thomas stopped rubbing his face. He blinked at her, the bourbon sloshing precariously in his glass. What do you mean you weren't invited? Of course you were invited. You're her sister. My mother, Maeve started, the words choking her. She had to force them out through the tightness in her throat. My mother came to my apartment on Tuesday. She brought me a check, $5,000, and a spa voucher. Thomas stared at her blankly. A check? To stay away, Maeve said, the dam breaking. The cynicism melted, leaving raw, bleeding truth. Because I'm unpolished, because I wear these boots, because I'm fat, and I have a scar on my face, and I don't fit into your country club aesthetic. Mom said I'd make Abigail look bad. She told me to stay home. Thomas didn't speak. He looked at Maeve, his eyes dropping to her heavy boots, then up to the scar slicing through her eyebrow, and finally locking onto her eyes. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, broken only by the distant, mocking sound of applause from the reception tent. Slowly, the confusion on Thomas's face curdled into something else. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp horror. She brought you a check, he repeated, his voice dangerously low. Yes. Thomas turned his head, staring at the glowing white tent. The string lights reflected in his eyes, making them look hollow. Thomas? Maeve asked, her anger faltering at the look on his face. He slowly turned back to her. His knuckles were white around his crystal glass. Do you know what Abigail told me this morning? Thomas asked, his voice shaking with a quiet, suppressed fury. Maeve shook her head slowly. I asked her if you had arrived, Thomas said, stepping closer, closing the gap between them until Maeve could smell the sharp tang of his anger. She started crying, heavy, gasping tears. She told me she had gone to your apartment to drop off a special bridesmaid gift. Thomas swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. She told me you threw the gift at the wall. She told me you screamed at her, that you said you hated her, that you hated me, and that you couldn't stomach watching her be happy because your own life was a miserable failure. Maeve felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands went numb. She said, What? She said you threatened to ruin the ceremony if we forced you to come, Thomas continued, his voice cracking. She had a panic attack in the bridal suite. My mother had to give her a beta blocker. Everyone in that tent thinks you're a jealous, unstable monster who broke your sister's heart on her wedding day. The gravel beneath Maeve's boots seemed to tilt. The sheer, labyrinthine cruelty of it took her breath away. They hadn't just erased her. They had weaponized her absence. They had built a cross out of her forced exile and nailed her to it, painting Abigail as the tragic, forgiving martyr. I haven't spoken to Abigail in 2 months, Maeve whispered, the truth sounding fragile in the heavy night air. I've been working. I never threatened her. I never. She stopped. She didn't need to defend herself. Thomas was looking at her, and for the first time since she met him, he actually saw her. He saw the grease under her nails. He saw the cheap tank top. And he saw the profound, devastating exhaustion of a woman who had been gaslit for 28 years. I know, Thomas said softly. He looked down at his glass of bourbon. Without a word, he turned his wrist and poured the amber liquid out onto the gravel. It hit the stones with a soft, wet hiss. I bought you a dress, you know, Thomas said quietly, not looking up. Abigail mentioned a few months ago that you were stressing about the cost of a gown, so I reached out to a designer in the city, put down a deposit. I thought it would be a nice surprise. Maeve stared at him, stunned. A dress? Yeah. Thomas finally looked up, his eyes hard and glassy. When I asked Abigail if you liked it, she told me you threw it in a dumpster because it was the wrong shade of blue. Maeve pressed her hands against her mouth, a dry sob tearing out of her chest. Thomas dropped the empty crystal glass onto the rocks. It didn't shatter, it just rolled away into the shadows. He reached up and pulled the loose bow tie from his neck, dropping it next to the glass. Mom said skip the wedding, Maeve choked out, the tears finally spilling over, hot and humiliating against her cheeks. She said I'd make her look bad. Thomas took a step toward her. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't try to touch her or comfort her with empty words. He just looked at the glowing tent in the distance, his jaw set like granite. "You didn't make her look bad, Maeve," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a lethal, quiet register. "She managed to do that all by herself. Come on." He gestured toward the gravel path leading back to the reception. Maeve froze, shrinking back against her car. "What?" "No, Thomas. No. I look like a mechanic. I can't go in there." "You're right," Thomas said, turning back to face her. His eyes were completely devoid of the golden boy warmth. They were dead, cynical, and utterly terrifying. "You can't go in there looking like that. But you aren't going in there to celebrate." He reached out and opened her car door. "You're going to drive me to the train station," Thomas said, "because if I walk back into that tent, I am going to burn it to the ground." The passenger door of the sedan whined in a high, metallic pitch as Thomas yanked it open. He didn't hesitate. He folded his tall frame into the cramped, sweltering cabin, his knees bumping against the cracked plastic of the glove compartment. He slammed the door shut. The whole car rocked with the force of it. Maeve stood paralyzed on the gravel for 3 seconds. Her brain misfired, trying to reconcile the sight of a groom in a bespoke tuxedo sitting in the passenger seat of a car that smelled perpetually of spilled latex paint and stale French fries. "Drive, Maeve," Thomas said through the open window. His voice was entirely hollowed out. She scrambled into the driver's seat. Her hands were slick with sweat, slipping slightly on the textured steering wheel. She jammed the key into the ignition. The engine turned over with a pathetic, grinding cough before finally catching. She didn't turn on the headlights, not until they were a quarter-mile down the service road, past the dense tree line that shielded the catering vans from the manicured lawns. In the rearview mirror, the glowing white canopy of the reception tent shrank into a small, bright smudge against the dark woods. Then it disappeared entirely behind a curve in the road. The silence inside the car was suffocating. Maeve rolled her window down further, desperate for the rush of hot night air to drown out the sound of her own ragged breathing. Thomas stared straight ahead. The orange glow of the streetlights rhythmically washed over his face as they hit the main road. He looked sick. His skin had taken on a pale, waxy quality, and a muscle near his jaw jumped in a frantic, irregular rhythm. "You don't have to do this," Maeve said. The words tasted like ash. She gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles ached. "You can go back. You can say you went for a walk. You had a stomach bug. They'll cover for you. Mom will spin it. Turn left at the light," Thomas said flatly. "Thomas," I said, "turn left." Maeve merged into the turning lane. The blinker clicked loudly, absurdly cheerful in the tense cabin. Thomas reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out his phone. The screen illuminated the dark interior, displaying a barrage of notifications. Missed calls, texts, a photo tag from the best man. Maeve caught a glimpse of Abigail's name stacked 5 times on the lock screen. Thomas didn't open any of them. He pressed his thumb against the side button, held it, and swiped the power icon across the glass. The screen went black. He tossed the dead phone into the center console cup holder, right next to a crumpled receipt for wood glue. "She lied to me," Thomas said to the windshield. He wasn't talking to Maeve. He was dissecting the reality of his own life in real time. "She looked me right in the eyes in our kitchen and sobbed about how much you hated her. She made me hold her." Maeve kept her eyes on the road. The asphalt looked greasy under the amber streetlights. "Abigail has always been creative." "That's not creativity, it's pathology." Thomas pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He let out a breath that sounded like a tire losing pressure. God, the red flags. They were everywhere. The catering staff, the florist, the way she speaks to your mother when the doors are closed. "My mother built her," Maeve said quietly. The realization wasn't new. Saying it out loud to an outsider felt strange, like handing over the blueprints to a haunted house. Abigail is the masterpiece. I was the rough draft they threw in the garbage. Thomas dropped his hands. He turned his head, looking at her in the dim light of the dashboard. He took in her profile, the grease smudges on her chin, the frayed collar of her tank top. You aren't the rough draft, he said. The absolute certainty in his voice made Maeve's throat tighten. You're just the only one in that house who isn't infected. They drove the rest of the way in silence. It wasn't a comfortable silence, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the heavy, shell-shocked quiet of two people sitting in the fallout zone of a detonation. Maeve's mind spun with the logistics of the catastrophe she was currently chauffeuring. The cake cutting, the frantic searches, Beatrice's cold, mounting panic, Abigail's perfectly curated aesthetic, shattering like cheap glass on a tile floor. She expected to feel triumphant. She expected a rush of vindictive glee. Instead, she just felt tired, a bone-deep, marrow-sucking exhaustion. The anger was gone, leaving only the dull ache of a phantom limb. She was finally, truly done with them. The commuter rail station on the edge of the county was a brutalist concrete slab, lit by harsh, buzzing fluorescent tubes that cast everything in a sickly green pallor. Moths the size of quarters threw themselves violently against the glass fixtures. The air smelled of ozone, hot brakes, and stale urine. Maeve pulled the sedan up to the curb of the deserted drop-off zone. She threw the car into park. Last train into the city leaves in 12 minutes, Thomas said, reading a rusted schedule board bolted to a concrete pillar. He didn't make a move to get out of the car. He sat there, staring at the empty tracks. The reality of what he was doing was settling heavily over his shoulders, pinning him to the cheap upholstery. He was a man abandoning his own wedding. By tomorrow morning, his name would be a curse word in 2 different area codes. His phone would be a radioactive hazard. "Where will you go?" Maeve asked. The engine idled roughly beneath them. "A hotel near the financial district. I have a buddy who manages it." "Then, I don't know." Thomas rubbed his jaw. The stubble was starting to show, dark against his pale skin. "Lawyers, mostly. Damage control. I have to call my parents before Beatrice gets a hold of them." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "The photos. God, the photographer." "Editorial," Maeve offered, a ghost of a smirk pulling at the corner of her mouth. Very raw, very exposed. Thomas looked at her. For the first time all night, a genuine, exhausted smile cracked across his face. It didn't reach his eyes, but it was there. Yeah. Raw. He grabbed the handle of the door. Before he opened it, he paused. He looked at Maeve's hands, still gripping the steering wheel. He reached out and briefly touched her wrist. His fingers were cold. "Change your locks, Maeve," he said, his voice dropping all pretense of humor. "Block their numbers. When this blows up, Beatrice will try to blame you. She'll say, you kidnapped me. She'll say you poisoned my mind." "I know," Maeve said. "I'm used to it." "Stop getting used to it," Thomas corrected sharply. "You don't owe them anything. Not your time, not your sanity, definitely not your apologies. Let them eat each other in that country club." Maeve looked at him. She saw the ruined tuxedo, the discarded bow tie back in the gravel, the empty cup holder where his phone sat like a dead weight. He was blowing up his entire world just to avoid becoming part of Abigail's. "Okay," Maeve breathed out, "I will." Thomas nodded once. He pushed the heavy car door open and stepped out into the humid night air. He grabbed his dead phone from the console, shoved it into his pocket, and slammed the door shut. Maeve watched him walk toward the concrete stairs leading up to the platform. He didn't look back. His shoulders were slumped, but his stride was even and deliberate. He looked exactly like a man walking away from a car crash he had narrowly survived. A loud metallic screech echoed through the quiet station as the 11:40 train pulled into view, its heavy yellow headlight cutting through the dark. Maeve shifted the car into drive. She pulled away from the curb before the train even came to a full stop. She merged back onto the empty road heading toward the city. She rolled all 4 windows down, letting the hot, rushing wind tear through the cabin. She reached over and cranked the volume dial on her cheap radio, letting static and heavy bass flood the interior. She thought about the $5,000 check sitting on her kitchen counter. She would tear it up, or maybe she would frame it. A monument to the exact price of her freedom. For the first time in 28 years, Maeve breathed in the night air, and it didn't smell like sandalwood or crushed juniper. It smelled like asphalt and impending rain. It smelled like nothing at all, and it was perfect. The truth has a funny way of making an entrance, even when it's strictly uninvited. Sometimes the only way to win a toxic game is to refuse to play, pack up your car, and drive the groom to the train station. Have you ever had a moment where you finally stopped trying to fit into a family that didn't want you? Share your stories in the comments below. If this raw, messy truth hit home, hit that like button, share with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more unfiltered stories.